was in 1924 that there finally appeared the book which, all in all, had me in its power for 12 years. It takes place in the long ago, the old days. The days of the world before the Great War, in the beginning of which so much began which is scarcely left off beginning. When a certain crisis shattered its way through life and consciousness, left a deep chasm behind.
An unassuming young man was traveling in midsummer from his native city of Hamburg to Switzerland on a 3-week visit. From Hamburg to Switzerland is a long journey, too long indeed for so brief a story. It crosses all sorts of country, goes uphill and down dale, descends from the platform of southern Germany to the shore of Lake Constance, until a magnificent succession of vistas opens before the awed eye of the solemn, phantasmagorical world of towering peaks. Two days' travel separated Hans Castorp, for such was the young man's name, from his youth, from his own world. Space, rolling and revolving between him and his native heath, possessed and wielded the powers we usually ascribe to time. From hour to hour it worked its changes in him. Space, like time, engenders forgetfulness. But it does so by setting us bodily free from our surroundings and giving us back our primitive, unattached state. This being carried upwards into regions where he'd never before drawn breath, it began to work upon him, to fill him with a certain concern. Time, we say, is lethe, but change of air is a similar draught, and if it works less thoroughly, does so more quickly.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Well, we're going to be dealing today with Thomas Mann's famous novel, The Magic Mountain. It's been called a monumental novel, and it is literally a monument to an era, a great epoch of German and European history. Thomas Mann began it as a small novella, but it gradually grew into an investigation of themes which were to obsess Thomas Mann throughout his life. Now, Thomas Mann chose to set the novel deliberately in a Swiss sanatorium. And the idea behind that was that he would be able to look at a cast of characters who were every day having to confront the idea of death, and who were therefore forced to look at their own lives and the meaning of their own lives. And in doing so, he was able to weave themes which deeply concerned him. One of the most important of those was this idea of the split in German culture between, on the one hand, the values of Western democratic civilization, and on the other hand, the deeply Germanic, almost Wagnerian ideas of Kultur.
By the time Thomas Mann came to write The Magic Mountain, he was already a successful novelist. He was born into a wealthy family in Lübeck, northern Germany, in 1875, and made his name with Buddenbrooks, a largely traditional kind of German novel. It's the story of the decline over 3 generations of a merchant family very close to his own childhood experience. Its world is the complacent one of German life at the end of the last century, when industrious burgher values had brought prosperity and stability to the nation. A largely comfortable world in which man lived a comfortable life as a noted writer. He was in other ways deeply at odds with Germany. A new 20th century spirit was emerging all over Europe, egalitarian, capitalist, and confident in the face of a scientific and industrial future. Man was deeply conservative, and the new mood was one he found hard to endorse. As an artist, he aligned himself with an older sense of his nation, to the romantic spirit of Goethe, Nietzsche, and Wagner. He began The Magic Mountain in the apparent calm of the pre-war years.
In the year 1912, over a generation ago now, my wife was suffering from a lung complaint, fortunately not a very serious one, but it was necessary for her to spend 6 months at a high altitude in a sanatorium in Switzerland. But in May, I visited my wife for some weeks. Now, there is a chapter in The Magic Mountain entitled Arrival. If you read this chapter, you'll have a fairly accurate picture of our meeting in this sphere and my own strange impression of it.
You had a pleasant journey hither, I hope. Do you already know your fate? I mean, has the mournful ceremony of the first examination taken place?
Not at all. Not really. You're under a misapprehension, Herr
Settembrini.
Herr Settembrini. I beg your pardon. No, you are mistaken. Really, I am not ill. I have come on a visit for a few weeks and shall take advantage of the opportunity to get a good rest.
Oh, well, you don't say. Then you are not one of us. You are a guest here, like Odysseus in the kingdom of the shades. You are bold indeed, thus to descend into these depths peopled by the vacant and the dead.
Descend, Herr Settembrini? But I have climbed up some 5,000 feet to get here.
That was only seeming. Upon my honor, it was an illusion. And how have you spent your day, the first of your sojourn in this gay resort?
Thanks very much. Quite according to the rules. Prevailing horizontal, as I hear you prefer to call it.
Oh, well, you find it amusing, this manner of existence.
Amusing or dull? Whichever you like. At all events, I haven't been bored. It seems as though I'd been here a long time instead of just a single day. As if I'd got older and wiser since I came.
Wiser, too? You will permit me to ask how old you are?
In my 24th year. I'll soon be 24. I beg your pardon, but I'm very tired.
You're in your 24th year, you say? Permit me to make a suggestion. Since your stay with us does not appear to be conducive, since you don't feel comfortable either physically or, unless I err, mentally, how would it be if you were to renounce the prospect of growing old on this spot? In short, what if you were to pack tonight and be up and away with the first suitable train?
The impressions grew stronger and stronger during the 3 weeks I spent visiting my wife while she was a patient. They are the same 3 weeks Hans Castorp originally meant to spend, though, of course, for him they became the 7 fairy tale years of his enchanted stay. I may say that they threatened to do the same for me. I'd been at the so-called Berghof for 10 days, sitting out on the balcony in cold, damp weather, when I got a troublesome bronchial cold. There were 2 specialists in the house, the head physician, his assistant, so I took the obvious course of consulting them.
Hello! If you feel any inclination to blub, kindly suppress it. We shall soon see through you, I expect, Castorp. You feel a little nervous about expressing your inner self to our gaze? Don't be alarmed. We preserve all the amenities. Look, have you seen my picture gallery? Hands, feet, knee pans, thigh and leg bones, arms, pelvises.
Very interesting.
Interesting, sure enough. Useful object lesson for the young. X-ray anatomy, you know. Triumph for the age. There's a female arm. You can tell by its delicacy. That's what they put round you when they make love, you know. Take off your shirt. Come over here. Don't pretend you're too tired. You get a free copy, Karstorp. Then you can project the secrets of your bosom on the wall for your children and grandchildren to see. Put your arms about. Embrace the board. Pretend it's something else if you like. Press your breast against it, as though it filled you with rapture. Like that. Hold it. Clear picture. Breathe deeper. Good. I'm looking at your heart.
From the doctor's half utterances, his broken phrases and bursts of scolding, the young man gathered that what he saw corresponded to his expectations.
Deep breathing.
He was so kind as to permit the patient, at his request, to look at his own hand through the screen. He gazed at this familiar part of his body, and for the first time in his life he understood that he would die. And at the thought that came over his face, the expression it usually wore when he listened to music, a little dull, sleepy, and pious, his mouth half open, his head inclined toward the shoulder.
Spooky, eh? There is something distinctly spooky about it. I'll let you know the results soon. Next delinquent!
If I had been Hans Castorp, the discovery of a so-called moist spot on my lung might have altered the whole course of my life. The physician assured me that I should be acting wisely, to remain there for 6 months and to take the cure. If I'd followed his advice, who knows, I might be there still. But I wrote The Magic Mountain instead. I conceived it as a humorous satire. The atmosphere was to be that strange mixture of death and lightheadedness, which I'd found in the sanatorium.
At its inception, Mann planned The Magic Mountain as a comic alternative to his morbid death in Venice. And when it was published, some people saw it merely as a lampoon on the medical profession. But Mann's aim was greater. His sanatorium is a metaphor for the wider world. Its fascination with illness and death, a microcosm for the broader state of Europe as it plummeted towards World War I. The characters under the medical microscope provide Mann with a chance to place his whole culture under various forms of analysis. While the doctors are diagnosing Hans' body, his soul is similarly probed by two ailing intellectuals.
Good evening, engineer. May I be permitted to look in on you? If so, I need light.
The first is Settembrini, a Democrat, rationalist, believer in man's better nature, and as such, representative of a new age.
How do you feel? Not too much cast down, I hope.
Thanks very much. I am subjectively as good as normal, and my cold is much better from lying in bed. But my temperature is still not what it should be. I have 99.5 to 99.7 all the time.
You take your temperature regularly?
Yes. 6 times a day like the rest of you.
Engineer, you know what admiration I feel for your profession. But you can only pursue it down in the world. Only there can you be a true European.
What shall I do?
What I told you.
You mean go away? Do you mean that after you've seen this photograph, after the X-ray and diagnosis, you take it upon yourself to advise me to go home?
Do you know what I mean by being lost to life? I know it. I see it here every day. 6 months at most after they get here, these young people, and they are mostly young who come, have lost every idea they had except flirtation and temperature. Yes, engineer, I take it upon myself The spirit must protest in pride and anguish against the dictates of the wretched body.
What have you against the body? You're a humanist, are you not? What can you have to say against the body?
Yes, certainly I'm a humanist. I affirm honor and love the body as I do form, beauty, freedom, the enjoyment of life. Yet within the antithesis of body and mind, the body is the evil, devilish principle, for the body is nature. And nature, within the sphere, I repeat, of her antagonism to the mind and to reason, is evil, mystical and evil. Have you heard of the Lisbon earthquake, engineer?
An earthquake? Oh, no, I see no newspapers up here.
I have in mind the one that visited Lisbon in 1755.
Pardon?
Well, Voltaire was outraged by it.
Outraged? How do you mean?
He rebelled. He declined to accept that brutal fact. His spirit refused to abdicate before it. He protested in the name of reason and the intellect against that scandalous dereliction of nature to which was sacrificed thousands of human lives. His attitude was that of a worthy descendant of those old Gauls who shot their arrows against the heavens. There, engineer, you have the hostility the intellect feels against nature.
One of the book's fundamental themes is that of heightening, of enhancement. Now, you will remember that my hero is, well, simple-minded fellow, the young scion of good Hamburg society and an indifferent engineer. But in the hermetic and feverish atmosphere of the Enchanted Mountain, the ordinary stuff of which he is made undergoes a heightening process that makes him capable of adventures in spiritual, moral, sensual worlds that he would never have dreamed of in the flatland. His story is the story of a heightening process. But also, as a narrative, it is the heightening process itself. It employs the methods of the realistic novel, but actually it is not one. It passes beyond realism by the use of symbolism, and it makes realism a vehicle for intellectual and ideal elements. Now, all the characters suffer this same process. They appear to the reader as something more than they are. In effect, they are nothing but exponents, representatives, emissaries from worlds, principalities, domains of the spirit.
Thomas Mann described The Magic Mountain as a novel of initiation, the initiation of Hans Castorp into an understanding of life. But it's not a process that always progresses smoothly, or which is treated without irony. As his stay in the sanatorium lengthens, Hans embarks on a massive program of study and thought, inspired by the enlightened Settembrini.
The volumes were heavy, unhandy. Hans Castorp propped them against his chest or stomach as he lay. His mouth half open, he let his eye glide down the learned page, following the lines down with his head until his chin lay sunk into his breast. And in this position he'd pause, perhaps for reflection, dozing a little or musing in half slumber, before lifting his eyes to the next page. He probed profoundly. What was life? No one knew. No one knew the actual point whence it sprang. One could point to no form of life that did not owe its existence to procreation by parents. What was life? It was warmth generated by a form-preserving instability, a fever of matter, a process of ceaseless decay and repair. It was a secret and ardent stirring in the frozen chastity of the universal. As he lay there in the frosty night, the image of life displayed itself to young Hans Castorp. It hovered before him, remote from his grasp, yet near his senses. This body, this opaquely whitish form. It looked down at him beneath drooping lids, out of slanting eyes. The acrid shadows of the armpits corresponded in a mystic triangle to the pubic darkness, just as the eyes did to the red mouth and the blossoms of the breasts below. Hans Castorp understood that this body, in the mysterious symmetry of its blood-nourished structure, was a living unit of a very high order indeed. The books lay piled upon the table. That one which he had latest read rested upon Hans Castorp's stomach and oppressed his breath. He beheld the image of life in flower. She lifted her hands from behind her head. She opened her arms. These arms were of unspeakable sweetness. She leaned above him. Something warm and tender grasped him round the neck, and upon his lips he felt the moist clinging of her kiss. Within the next few days, it would be 7 months since Hans Castorp's advent among those up here. The carnival season was at hand, and Hans inquired among the older inhabitants what it would be like.
Magnifique! You shall see, engineer, the gayest gallants of the night in brilliant rows advancing. What do you expect? Even in Maison de Santé, they have their balls for the fools and idiots. The program will include various danses macabre, as you may imagine. But unfortunately, some of last year's guests will not be with us.
And so it fell out. Shrove Tuesday came on apace, and in the evening there were festivities in the hall and the reception rooms, in the course of which... but we alone know to what, thanks to Hans Castorp's enterprising spirit, these carnival gaieties led in their course.
Let us sit here and look on as though in a dream. For it is a dream to me that we are sitting like this, like a particularly deep dream. You have to sleep very deeply to dream like this.
Poète. Bourgeois, humaniste et poète. The perfect German gentleman.
Do you happen to have a pencil?
Let me see. Perhaps I have. Voila.
A poor thing. But yours.
Ah, so you are even witty.
Je te le dirai en français. What I have been thinking. Avec toi, je préfère cette langue à la mienne. Car pour moi, parler français, c'est parler sans parler, sans responsabilité. Ou comme nous parlons en rêve. Tu m'as rencontré à l'atelier de photographie intime, dans l'antichambre. Tu te souviens?
Je me souviens un peu.
Donc ce jour-là, Berens a fait ton portrait transparent?
Mais oui.
Mon Dieu, elle a tout sur toi?
Non, je l'ai dans ma chambre.
J'aimerais beaucoup mieux voir ton portrait intérieur qui est enfermé dans ta chambre.
Cela t'intéresse? Écoute, je veux t'expliquer une chose. Il me semble qu'il faudrait chercher la morale, non dans la vertu, c'est-à-dire dans la raison, la discipline, les bonnes mœurs, l'honnêteté, mais plutôt dans le contraire. Je veux dire dans le péché, en s'abandonnant au danger, à ce qui est nuisible et ce qui nous consume. Il me semble qu'il est plus moral de se perdre et même de se laisser dépérir que de se conserver. Les grands moralistes n'étaient point des vertueux, mais des aventuriers de le mal. Tout ça doit te déplaire beaucoup, n'est-ce pas?
Je t'aime. Je t'ai aimé de tout temps.
Petit bourgeois. Joli bourgeois, là, la petite tache humide. Est-ce vrai que tu m'aimes tant?
Oh, l'amour. Le corps, l'amour, la mort. Ces trois ne font qu'un. On regarde la symétrie merveilleuse de l'édifice humain.
Tu es en effet un galant. Je vais partir. Demain, après dîner. Adieu, mon prince carnaval.
Now, the scene between Hans Castorp and Madame Chauchat is highly comic. Up till now, we've seen Hans Castorp very much as the innocent, earnest, serious, typical young German from the lowlands, anxious to learn about life. With Madame Chauchat, we have a new element introduced, namely the erotic lady. And she is able, by teasing this young man, by deliberately asking him to come up to her room to look at her internal photographs, she is able to tease him into becoming a pawn for her ridicule. Well, after that night of instruction, let's call it, Madame Chauchat leaves the sanatorium, and her place is taken by a much more ominous character, and the tone of the book once again becomes more serious. In fact, Thomas Mann referred to the book as this very serious jest, and he wanted to counterpoint the two sides. Professor Nafta, the new character we meet, is a cynical, outrageously Machiavellian character, contemptuous of noble ideas of progress. He's a complete fatalist and realist.
Good afternoon, Herr Nafta. We've come for a little visit.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Oh, what is this you have here? It's frightfully good. What depiction of suffering. It's old, of course.
14th century, probably comes from the Rhine. Does it impress you?
Enormously. I should never have thought there could be anything in the world at once so... Oh, forgive me. So ugly and so beautiful.
All works of art whose function is to express the soul and the emotions are always so ugly as to be beautiful, and so beautiful as to be ugly. That is a law. Their beauty is not fleshy beauty, which is merely insipid, but the beauty of the spirit.
I am most grateful to you for making these distinctions, sir. 14th century. What is the name of the artist?
What does it matter? It was not created by some wonderful and well-advertised single genius. It is an anonymous product. Anonymous and communal. T.
And Nafta. Every word you say interests me enormously. Anonymous and communal. That will take some thinking about.
In part, the opposition between Settembrini and Nafta reflects Mann's own relationship with his brother Heinrich. Mann often said that the differences between them were in essence the conflict at the centre of the European soul. Heinrich too was a successful writer, but unlike his brother, he was also a precociously modern thinker, whom Mann believed denied the essential inner spirit of his culture. Professor Nafta is a creative transposition of Mann's own trysts with German romanticism and darkness, while Heinrich's views are caricatured in the figure of Settembrini.
The degradation of humanity is precisely synchronous with the growth of the bourgeois spirit. Renaissance, Age of Enlightenment, the natural sciences and economics of the 19th century have left nothing undone or untaught which could forward this degradation. Modern astronomy, for example, has converted the Earth, the center of the all, into an indifferent little planet, and thus, at least for the present, put an end to the majestic cosmic position of man.
For the present?
Certainly. For a few hundred years, that is. Science will see itself philosophically enforced to put the Earth back in the position of supremacy in which she was installed by the dogma of the Church.
What? Science philosophically enforced? And what about pure knowledge? What about the unfettered quest for truth?
My good sir, there is no such thing as pure knowledge. Faith is the vehicle of knowledge, intellect is secondary. Your pure science is a myth. The great schoolmen of the 12th and 13th centuries agreed that what is false in theology cannot be true in philosophy.
But this...
A cultural conception which refuses to recognize that what is philosophically false cannot be scientifically true is not worthy of the name. The accusation of the Holy Office against Galileo stated that his thesis was philosophically absurd. A more crushing arraignment could not well be.
the arguments separating Settembrini and NAFTA became, in the novel, a symbol for those arguments dividing intellectual life in Germany and, in fact, in Europe at that moment before the First World War. Thomas Mann felt that there must be a synthesis between these two different views of life, the rationalist view and the fatalist view. And he looked for it in one of the most powerful figures of 19th century German culture, Wagner and Nietzsche. Now, years before, Nietzsche had written a book called The Birth of Tragedy. And in that book, he had explored the contrast between two great Greek archetypes, the Apollonian, clear-thinking, classical, rationalist view of civilization, and on the other hand, the Dionysian view of civilization, lustful, voluptuous, elemental. And Nietzsche believed that it wasn't sufficient to have simply the noble, dignified Apollonian approach. You also had to have an experience of its opposite, that dark, cruel world of Dionysus, in order to make it complete. And fusing those themes in a chapter called Snow, Hans Castorp, our hero, is given a revelation similar to Nietzsche's, whose book had in fact provided Mann not only with the central vision of his novel, but even with its title, The Magic Mountain. Now the Olympic Magic Mountain opens to our view and shows us its roots.
Incomprehensible, which doesn't prevent it at the same time from being silly. Either the experience of death is the last experience of life, or else it must be a boogaloo, pure and simple.
Disease is very human indeed. To be man...
Hans Castorp is granted his Nietzschean vision of man's essential state when, tired of the futile combat between Settembrini and NAFTA, he sets out alone into the snows.
Such a scene Hans Castorp had never beheld. Of the Mediterranean he knew nothing, and yet he remembered. It is not of our single souls we dream, he thought. We dream anonymously and communally. His whole heart opened in responsive love to the scene. But then, passing into a temple, the poor soul's knees all but gave way at the sight within. He tried desperately to escape and found himself, with the sound of that dreadful brawling still in his ears, lying in the snow. It was no true awakening. I have made a dream poem of humanity, he thought. I have dreamed of man's courteous and enlightened social state, behind which, in the temple, a horrible blood sacrifice was consummated. From love alone can form come, but always in silent recognition of that horror. Can one tell, that is to say, narrate time itself for its own sake? That would surely be an absurd undertaking. It would be as though one held a single note or chord for a whole hour and called it music, for narration resembles music in this, that it fills up the time. For time is the medium of narration, as it is the medium of life. How long, since what date had Hans Castorp been up here? How much mental time had he spent in the House Berghof? No one asked him those questions, and he probably shrank from asking himself. He would sit sometimes with his watch open in his hand, looking at the little second hand, taking its busy, ticking course round its own small circle. Watching the second hand, he essayed to hold time by the tail, to cling to and prolong the passing moments. But the way it passed over the markings on the face showed that all the figures and divisions on its path were simply beneath it, that it moved on, and he shoved the watch back in his pocket and left time to take care of itself.
One of the chief themes of The Magic Mountain is the mystery of time. It is, in a double sense, a time romance. First, in a historical sense, in that it seeks to present the inner significance of an epoch, the pre-war period of European history. And secondly, because time is one of its themes. Time dealt with not only as a part of the hero's experience, but also in and through itself. The book is itself the substance of that which it relates. I began work on it in 1912, but before it progressed far, the First World War broke out. Now, this did two things. First, it put an immediate stop to my work on the book, and it incalculably enriched its contents at the same time. I did not work on it again for years. The book which finally emerged in 1924 would not have found readers 10 years earlier, nor could it even have been written. It needed the experiences that the author had in common with his countrymen. And these he had betimes to let ripen within him, and then at the favorable moment, as once before, to come forward with his bold production. The national crisis had produced in the general public precisely that alchemical keying up in which had consisted the actual adventures of young Hans Castorp. Yes, certainly, the German reader recognized himself in the simple-minded but shrewd young hero of the novel. He could and would be guided by him.
When The Magic Mountain was finally published, its mixture of 19th century realism and a modern symbolist style spoke directly to a Europe still reeling from the experience of war. It became the first of Mann's books to reach a wide international audience and was to earn him in due course the Nobel Prize. More than any other novel of its time, it seemed to probe the origins of the Great War and to capture the bleak and lowering post-war mood. Although the book's philosophical climax happens in the chapter called Snow, Mann was unwilling to leave it at that, and the second half of the book is more directly concerned with the approach of war. After the failure of the historical tensions represented by NAFTA and Settembrini to find any kind of reconciliation, their central role is supplanted by a new anti-intellectual presence, that of the charismatic Peter Pieperkorn.
Mynheer Pieperkorn, an elderly Dutchman, spent some time at the House Berghof.
Ha! Oh, my dears, how are we?
He was a colonial Dutchman from Java. His slightly faded nationality is scarcely sufficient grounds for introducing him at this late stage into our story, but the reader need not fear that in him another occasion for pedagogic strife has arrived on the scene. No, Mynheer Pieperkorn was a quite different man, as we shall see.
Yes. Now, no. This is... There are...
He was an odd man and of great personal weight, though incoherent. The population of the sanatorium were enthusiastic over him. Most were soon absorbed by his personality, spellbound by the pallid eye, by the brow's mighty folds, by the compulsion of the gestures his hands performed, and never for one moment were they conscious of any lack in his incoherent, rhapsodic remarks.
Lord, what a stupid old man we have here, engineer. What is it you see in him? I am at a loss.
You find it stupid, Herr Settembrini. And I admit it is unclear, which in your eyes is even worse. Well, there are many kinds of stupidity, and cleverness is one of the worst. I am speaking of the mystery of the personality. Something above either cleverness or stupidity. It seems to me positive and absolute, like life. Mynheer Pieperkorn has a gift. Say what you like. He can stick us all in his pocket.
You see the very diaphragm.
After the abstract arguments of Nafta and Settembrini, Pieperkorn is, to Hans Castorp, the somewhat awesome embodiment of reality, not theory. By sheer force of physical presence, he woos Hans away from his over-scrutinized life, and in his virility becomes a figure representing literal force as well. This essence is summed up in a remarkable scene by a waterfall.
Oh, look! The flowers of Paradise Valley!
It is both comic and full of elemental foreboding.
God. Oh, this air! Oh, this air! This characteristic thawing air! With its somewhat enervating breath, full of promises, memories of spring. We should give it out only in the form of praise, of complete and utter, in honor of May I draw your attention. You see that black arching point against the sky? It is a bird of prey. It is an eagle. He circles directly overhead, tremendous height, peering earthward. A golden eagle. A bird of Jove, eh? He has feathered gaiters, a beak of iron, talons of enormous strength. Why are you circling? Spying on us, eh? Strike! Strike downward with your iron beak into the head and eyes. Tear out the belly of the creature God gives you. Splendid! And bury your talons in its entrails. Make your beak drip with blood. Come.
Pieperkorn ushers the Magic Mountain towards its tragic denouement. For the characters in the sanatorium are, like the people of Europe in 1914, doomed. His disturbing influence signals an end to the interplay of contrasting ideas, and the romantic, elemental Pieperkorn is himself the first to fall. Immediately after the scene by the waterfall, he commits suicide, introducing a note of frenetic disorder into the sanatorium. One by one, the options represented by the various characters are closed, and with them, Europe's hopes of avoiding war. The quarrel between Nafta and Settembrini reaches its climax, and this time leads to another death.
Expression you were pleased to use?
I was pleased to say, am pleased to say, that I am resolved to prevent you from continuing to molest a defenseless youth with your equivocations.
I invite you, sir, to take heed of your words.
The reminder, sir, is unnecessary. I am accustomed to take heed to my words. They will precisely fit the fact if I say that your way of misleading unsettled youth is infamous and cannot receive a stronger chastisement than it merits.
Infamous. Chastisement. Have the bleating sheep taken to butting? Have we driven the policemen of civilization so far that they will draw their weapons? I hope that your civilized principles will not prevent you from knowing what you owe me. Else I shall be forced to put those principles to a test that... I see that will not be necessary. I am in your way. You are in mine. Good. We will transfer the settlement of our differences to a suitable place. You will hear from me.
And you will find a hearing, sir.
He challenged you.
Undoubtedly.
Shall you take it up?
Can you ask? Theoretically, I disapprove of the duel. In practice, however, it is another matter.
There are situations where quarrels that... In short, I am at the man's service.
Gentlemen, I am convinced...
You will develop your convictions another time. The weapons, if you please. We will begin. Come forward, sir, and fire. You fired in the air!
I fired where it pleased me to fire.
You will fire again!
I have no such intention. It is your turn.
Coward!
Come in.
Good evening, Herr Settembrini.
Good evening, engineer.
And how are you feeling?
Long ago, it had been Herr Settembrini who brought sudden illumination into the room, sat down beside the horizontal Hans, and sought to influence him upon matters of life and death.
The world situation puzzles me.
But now, it was the pupil who, seated at the bedside of the humanist, kept him company and listened to his utterances upon the state of Europe. For in those days, Settembrini was seldom on his legs. His voice was weak, but he spoke beautifully still. His words came softly as though on the wings of a dove. Yet when he came to speak of the unification and universal well-being of the liberated peoples, there mingled a sound as of the rushing pinions of eagles. For Herr Settembrini was a humanitarian, but when humanity united itself in support of a triumphant and domineering world civilization, there was some doubt whether he would hold back from the shedding of blood. It seemed the prevailing temper more and more held sway in his mind. The boldness of the eagle was gradually outbidding the mildness of the dove.
Diplomatic collaboration between my own country and Austria I should regard as wholly dishonorable.
The tragedy of the Magic Mountain reaches its climax as Hans Castorp, who's been the pawn in so many clashes of will and ideology, prepares to leave this sanatorium and join the ranks of uniformed German soldiers in the First World War. He's glad that after all that philosophizing and questioning, he can simply surrender himself to the larger, higher forces of history. Hans Castorp's education has been a failure. But out of that failure, Thomas Mann has made an epic book. Just as his novel Buddenbrooks had been a memorial to the German merchants of the 19th century, so The Magic Mountain is a monument to the cultural and historical crisis afflicting not only Germany, but Europe as well, before the First World War. For a while, Mann himself had been embittered by Germany's defeat in the First World War, and he had, in fact, welcomed Soviet-style communist revolution in Munich rather than the detested hypocrisies, as he saw them, of the Western Entente allies. But in time after the First World War, he became reconciled to Western ideas of humanism and democracy. The Magic Mountain therefore ends on a note of hope, that out of pain and suffering, the conflict between these ideas, a newer, wiser, more humane society will emerge. Sadly, it was an expectation in vain. Thomas Mann would become one of the first writers to be exiled from Nazi Germany. He was deprived of his German citizenship in 1936, and he'd spend the years of the Second World War in exile in America. The Magic Mountain was burned in Hitler's Germany, but elsewhere, it came to be acknowledged as one of the great novels of the 20th century. Its author, the spokesman of humanity and world peace, up to his death in 1955.
What Hans Castorp comes to understand is that one must go through the deep experience of sickness and death in order to arrive at a higher sanity and health. In just the same way that one must have a knowledge of sin in order to find redemption. There are, Hans Castorp says, two ways to life. One is the regular, direct, and good way, and the other is bad. It leads through death, and that is the way of genius. Hans Castorp is a searcher after the Holy Grail. If he does not find the Grail, yet he divines it before he is snatched downwards from his heights into the European catastrophe. It is the idea of a human being, the conception of a future humanity that has passed through and survived the profoundest knowledge of disease and death. The Grail is a mystery, but humanity is a mystery too, for man himself is a mystery, and all humanity rests upon reverence before the mystery that is man.
During those days, the nerves of Europe were on the rack. The newspapers, with their wild, chaotic contents, pressed up out of the depths to his very balcony. Yet our hero felt himself released. His favorite piece was especially and exemplarily German, Schubert's The Linden Tree. The song meant a whole world, a world he loved. What was the world behind the song, which the motions of his conscience made to seem a world of forbidden love? It was death. Behind so lovely a song stood death. The moist air is rent by a sharp, singing whine. East, west, it is the flat land, it is the war. They must get through those 3,000 ardent youths. They must reinforce with their bayonets the attack on the burning villages, the trenches in front of the line of hills. They fling themselves down before the projectiles that come howling on. Then they leap up again and hurry forward. They exult in their young, breaking voices as they run to discover themselves still unhit. Or they are hit. They fall, fighting the air with their arms. Farewell, honest Hans Castorp. Farewell. Your tale is told, and if thou livest or diest, thy prospects are poor. The desperate dance in which thy fortunes are caught up will last yet many a sinful year. We should not care to set a high state on thy life by the time it ends. Out of this universal feast of death, may it be that love one day shall mount.
Und seine Zweige